Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine an attempted assassination targeting U.S. President Donald Trump, rising cartel violence in Mexico following key arrests, and a major bombing in Colombia likely aimed at undermining the government ahead of elections. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at Ukraine's continued deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure and a growing deadlock in the Strait of Hormuz that is increasing the risk of renewed conflict between the United States and Iran. We also assess a major militant offensive in Mali, protest risks in Chad, renewed attacks in northeastern Nigeria, and a spike in piracy incidents off the coast of Somalia. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover renewed clashes along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, highlighting the fragility of recent de-escalation efforts. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where an attempted assassination targeting President Trump highlights the growing threat of political violence. On the evening of April 25th, a gunman opened fire inside the Washington Hilton Hotel. The hotel was hosting the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner, attended by most senior figures in the U.S. government, including President Donald Trump. The shooter reportedly fired at Secret Service officers in the hotel lobby, injuring one officer, and was subsequently detained at the scene. The attacker reportedly sent a manifesto to family members and acquaintances. In it, he justified his actions by stating that he was no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat his hands with his crimes. He also stated that he would target all administration officials. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The Correspondents' Dinner shooting is the third major assassination attempt targeting President Trump. These include the shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania in July 2024, and the assassination attempt in West Palm Beach, Florida, both of which occurred during the electoral campaign. U.S. security forces have also reportedly thwarted several other plots. For example, in February 2026, Secret Service agents shot and killed an individual who attempted to enter Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. Trump was not at the residence at the time of the incident. The Washington attacker almost certainly acted alone. This is evidenced by the relatively unsophisticated planning and execution of the attack, as well as the content of his manifesto. He does not appear to have identified with a clear ideology. However, he did state that he was abiding by self-imposed rules of engagement, aimed at minimizing the threat to bystanders. More broadly, the attack can likely be contextualized within a wider increase in the threat of targeted political violence in the United States. According to the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, incidents of targeted violence increased by around 30% between 2024 and 2025. Over the same period, the U.S. Capitol Police reported an almost 60% rise in threats against members of Congress. There is a realistic possibility of further targeted assassination attempts and political violence in the United States, particularly in connection with several upcoming major events. These include the June to July FIFA World Cup, which the U.S. will host alongside Mexico and Canada, the July 4th celebrations, marking the 250th anniversary of the country's founding, and the November midterm elections. Staying in the region, Mexican authorities have arrested key cartel leaders, triggering immediate violence and raising the risk of further retaliation. On April 27th, units of the Mexican Marines carried out a raid in Nayarit, leading to the arrest of Arias Flores Silva, also known as El Jardinero. Flores Silva is considered one of the key leaders of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, often cited as the most powerful cartel currently operating in Mexico. He is believed to have been responsible for the cartel's Pacific Coast operations. He had already been the target of several security operations, including a failed raid in 2023. Following the killing of El Mencho, CJNG's overall leader, during a police raid in February 2026, El Jardinero was widely assessed as a potential successor. An operation on the same day also resulted in the arrest of one of the CJNG's top money launderers. Following the arrest, several clashes, roadblocks, and incidents of arson were reported across the state of Nayarit. These were particularly concentrated in Tecuala, Bahia de Banderas, and near the popular tourist resort of Puerto Vallarta in Jalisco State. Authorities were forced to suspend public transport services in several towns and issued warnings for residents to remain indoors. Also on April 27th, Mexican authorities carried out a raid in Tamaulipas, resulting in the arrest of Alexander Bonavides, also known as El Metro 9. He is a member of the Cartel del Golfo, or Gulf Cartel, specifically its Los Metros faction. The arrest prompted cartel members to establish improvised blockades and carry out acts of sabotage, particularly in the city of Reynosa. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Cartel-focused researchers have noted that the capture of El Jardinero will highly likely constitute a severe blow to the CJNG, possibly exceeding the impact of the killing of former leader El Mencho. The CJNG does not operate as a monolithic, vertically organized group. Instead, it largely functions as a decentralized network, in which local cells are afforded a significant degree of autonomy, while senior leadership provides overall strategic direction. Within this framework, second-tier leaders such as El Jardinero play a critical role. They coordinate local cells and help ensure the stability of the cartel's franchise model within their areas of responsibility. For El Jardinero, this included Zacatecas, Guerrero, Nayarit, Jalisco, and Michoacán. He also reportedly played a key role between 2024 and 2025 in forming an alliance between the CJNG and Los Chapitos, a faction of the Sinaloa cartel that emerged as one of the most prominent groups in Mexico following the cartel's fragmentation in 2024. For these reasons, the capture of El Jardinero is likely to further destabilize the CJNG. The initial wave of violence following the arrests resembles that seen after El Mencho's killing, but has been more muted, likely due to El Jardinero's lower profile. However, further violence remains possible, including retaliatory attacks against security forces in Nayarit. In the longer term, there is a realistic possibility that his capture will increase friction between CJNG cells along the Pacific coast. This, in turn, raises the risk of cartel fragmentation and interfactional violence, particularly if additional senior leaders or regional commanders are captured or killed. El Jardinero's capture comes amid an increase in security operations targeting the cartels. While these efforts have been most successful against the CJNG, Mexico City has also expanded operations against other groups. In addition to the raid that led to the arrest of El Metro 9, the Mexican Navy carried out another operation targeting the Gulf Cartel in Tamaulipas State. This resulted in the seizure of approximately 8.3 million Mexican pesos worth of vehicles and equipment, reportedly used by the cartel to conduct fuel theft operations in the state. On April 22nd, federal authorities carried out a raid in Durango, leading to the arrest of several high-ranking members of Gente del Guano, or GDG, a splinter faction of the Sinaloa cartel led by Aureliano Guzman Loera, also known as El Guano, the older brother of the historic Sinaloa cartel leader El Chapo, who has been in U.S. custody since 2016. Mexico's crackdown on the cartels, likely driven in large part by pressure from Washington, could increase the likelihood of retaliatory actions by organized criminal groups. This may have implications for the upcoming June to July FIFA World Cup, which Mexico will co-host alongside the United States and Canada. Cartels almost certainly retain the capacity to disrupt the tournament and undermine the central government. However, given the security demands of the event and the potential for cartel retaliation following recent operations, it is likely that Mexico City will suspend such operations shortly before and during the tournament. This would reduce the risk of retaliatory violence while allowing security forces to be reallocated to host cities, transport hubs, and other tournament-related duties. Also in the Americas, a major roadside bombing in Colombia was likely intended to maximize civilian casualties and destabilize the country ahead of elections. On April 25th, a bomb was detonated on the Pan American Highway near the town of Cajibio in the Cauca department of southwest Colombia. The explosion killed at least 21 people and injured dozens. It also caused major disruption along one of Colombia's most important transit corridors. Reports indicate that the device was detonated after assailants stopped traffic, blocking the road with a bus and another vehicle. Local Governor Octavio Guzman described the attack as indiscriminate in nature and the most brutal against civilians in decades. President Gustavo Petro blamed the attack on Iván Mordisco, Colombia's most wanted criminal, and the current leader of the Central General Staff, Estado Mayor Central, or EMC. This is an active dissident group of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, which never agreed to the 2016 ceasefire or the FARC peace accord that same year. Petro also stated that those responsible are terrorists, fascists, and drug traffickers, and said he intends to deploy Colombia's best soldiers to confront them. On April 27th, Colombia's defense minister, Pedro Sanchez, announced a reward of $1.4 million for information leading to the capture of Iván Jacob Idrobo Arredondo, also known as Marlon, a senior EMC commander identified as directly responsible for the attack. The incident followed a bomb attack on April 24th, targeting a military base in Cali, Colombia's third-largest city, which injured 2 people. It also came amid a series of coordinated attacks across the Valle del Cauca and Cauca departments. According to the Commander General of the military forces, Hugo Lopez, 26 attacks were recorded across the 2 departments within 2 days. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The bombing of civilians on a high-traffic transport corridor is almost certainly one of the most significant developments in Colombia's civil conflict during President Petro's administration. The use of a bus and an additional vehicle to block traffic prior to the detonation highly likely indicates that the attack was intended to cause civilian casualties and maximize visibility. This almost certainly marks a significant escalation in the current conflict between the Colombian state and far-right dissident groups, as most recent attacks have primarily targeted security forces or critical infrastructure rather than directly targeting the civilian population. The attack is likely to increase pressure on the Petro administration to adopt a more aggressive security posture. It will likely lead to increased troop deployments and expanded security operations in southwest Colombia, as well as in other areas where the EMC is most deeply embedded. However, this approach is also likely to provoke further militant attacks. The EMC remains dominant across large parts of southern Colombia and continues to maintain significant influence in areas of central and eastern Colombia. The attack was likely aimed at destabilizing Colombia and undermining the Petro administration ahead of the presidential election, scheduled for May 31st. Incumbent President Petro, who was elected in 2022, is constitutionally barred from seeking a consecutive second term. However, a significant increase in the frequency and scale of attacks by the EMC and other armed groups is likely intended to weaken both the administration and the governing Historic Pact Party. Iván Cepeda, the Historic Pact's presidential candidate, is currently polling as the frontrunner. He is one of the principal architects of Colombia's total peace strategy, which advocates for political negotiations and ceasefires with all armed groups in the country. Cepeda has also frequently acted as Petro's primary negotiator with these groups. However, following a series of ceasefire breakdowns, failed negotiations, and high-profile attacks by the EMC, the National Liberation Army, and other armed groups, the total peace strategy has come under increasing scrutiny and has become a political vulnerability for the central government. Under President Petro, government operations against armed groups have increased significantly, including efforts to capture militant leaders such as Ivan Mordisco. These attacks are likely to increase in the lead-up to the presidential election. They are primarily intended to undermine the incumbent administration's ability to guarantee security, particularly following its shift away from the total peace approach. They are also likely aimed at sending a strategic message to other presidential candidates that government operations designed to contain the influence of armed groups or disrupt their activities will be met with significant armed resistance. In 2025, Senator Miguel Uribe Turbay, a presidential candidate, was assassinated by contract killers whom the government linked to FARC dissidents. Uribe was a prominent critic of total peace and advocated a more hardline approach towards Colombia's armed groups. He argued that the policy granted groups like the EMC a degree of legitimacy and was ultimately exploited to consolidate territorial control and expand illicit activities. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure continues to intensify. On April 27th, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, visited St. Petersburg to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin against the backdrop of the unresolved conflict in the Middle East. During the meeting, Putin reaffirmed Russia's strategic relationship with Tehran. He also offered to mediate in the Iran war and repeated a proposal for Russia to store Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium as a potential means of resolving the conflict. With the Iran war driving an energy supply shock that has benefited Russian hydrocarbon revenues, Ukraine has also escalated its deep strike campaign against Russian oil and gas infrastructure. Overnight, from April 25th to 26th, Ukrainian forces successfully struck the Yaroslavl oil refinery. Then, on April 28th, Ukrainian drones hit the Black Sea Tuapse refinery and terminal complex for the third time in less than 2 weeks. The refinery had already halted production on April 16th, following earlier Ukrainian strikes. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Russia's alliance with Iran was formalized and deepened in January 2025 with the signing of the 20-year Iranian-Russian Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Throughout the war, Iran has supplied Russia with a range of capabilities. Most notably, this includes Shahed one-way attack drones, which Russia uses in large quantities against Ukraine, and is now producing domestically with Iranian technical support and training. Iran has also supplied ballistic missiles and artillery ammunition, and has supported sanctions evasion. Russia is constructing 2 additional reactors at Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant. However, Russian staff were evacuated from the site due to the ongoing unresolved conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. Multiple reports suggest that the Russia-Iran alliance has extended to the provision of Russian intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support for Iran during the current conflict. This has resulted in more refined targeting of US forces. The war in the Middle East has almost certainly significantly benefited Russian state revenues. This is due to Russia's high level of energy self-sufficiency and the substantial income it continues to generate from oil and gas exports. The World Bank's April 2026 commodity outlook forecasts that energy prices will rise by 24% this year, reaching their highest level since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Brent crude surged by approximately 40% in March. This has highly likely contributed to the sharp escalation in Ukrainian deep strikes, with Kyiv likely calculating that increased strike activity against energy infrastructure is necessary to offset higher Russian state revenues. In March, Ukraine conducted at least 565 strikes. By late March, it was estimated that at least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity had been halted, the most significant disruption in modern Russian history. Moreover, on April 28, Ukraine's defense ministry stated that Kyiv's deep strike range has expanded from 630 kilometers at the start of the full-scale invasion to 1,750 kilometers. This has enabled strikes against both oil facilities and military-industrial sites much deeper inside Russia. Despite the significant successes of the deep strike campaign, it is unlikely to have fully offset the increase in Russian revenues, driven by rising energy prices. The net effect of these competing factors, escalated Ukrainian attacks and higher prices, has likely still resulted in an almost doubling of Russia's weekly revenues, compared with pre-February 28 levels. Despite the substantial revenues generated by higher energy prices, macroeconomic indicators continue to suggest that Russia's war economy remains fragile. The Bank of Russia's decision on April 24 to cut its key interest rate by 50 basis points to 14.5% likely reflects growing confidence that inflation is stabilizing. However, it also likely indicates concern that prolonged high borrowing costs are constraining investment, credit growth, and broader economic activity. While Ukraine's deep strike campaign is unlikely to coerce Moscow into abandoning its maximalist objectives, it has likely helped prevent the higher energy revenues linked to the Iran war from fully offsetting Russia's mounting economic constraints. Economic constraints have likely prevented the Russian military from resuming its previously high enlistment bonuses for volunteers. These bonuses almost certainly enabled Russia to sustain its manpower advantage despite ongoing battlefield losses, but they have dropped considerably since the start of 2025. Without the ability to restore such payments, Russian battlefield losses, which have reportedly exceeded new recruitment levels for at least the past 2 months, will likely increase pressure on the Kremlin to expand conscription further. This, in turn, would likely reduce domestic support for the war in Ukraine, or degrade Russia's ability to conduct and sustain large-scale, multi-axis offensives. In the Middle East, the ongoing deadlock in the Strait of Hormuz is increasing the risk of a return to full-scale conflict between the United States and Iran. On April 25, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with Pakistani leadership in Islamabad. He reportedly set out Tehran's demands, including that the U.S. naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz be lifted as a precondition for talks. Araghchi also proposed resolving the Strait crisis first, through an extension of the ceasefire, with nuclear negotiations delayed to a later stage. U.S. President Donald Trump subsequently announced that a planned trip to Islamabad by U.S. negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner had been cancelled. He cited Tehran's unchanged negotiating position and a lack of commitment to meet, but added that this does not signal a resumption of war. On April 29, U.S. officials said that the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is set to depart the Middle East and return to its home port in Virginia in the coming days. On April 30, President Trump was reportedly set to receive a briefing from Central Command's commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, on potential plans for new military action against Iran. U.S. officials have variously indicated that the proposals include a short and powerful wave of strikes, likely targeting infrastructure, a plan to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by force, potentially involving ground troops, and a special forces operation to secure Iran's buried stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Ongoing disputes over the Strait of Hormuz and the absence of further U.S.-Iran talks to formally extend the ceasefire have almost certainly increased the risk of a return to full-scale conflict. The United States and Iran are, in effect, in a stalemate. Washington almost certainly intends to use its blockade to pressure Iran into making concessions on the nuclear file. This likely reflects an assessment that Iran has only limited capacity to store oil and may soon be forced to reduce production. At the same time, Tehran highly likely calculates that the United States would be unable to tolerate a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz resulting from Iranian action. The current status quo in the Strait of Hormuz is almost certainly untenable for both the United States and Iran over the long term, and it is unlikely that either side will be willing to sustain it indefinitely. Some research estimates that Iran may have only 12 to 22 days of remaining storage capacity for its domestic oil production due to the U.S. blockade limiting exports. However, the impact on Iranian revenues would likely not be felt for another 3 to 4 months. Other analysts point out that, based on Iran's experience of stockpiling oil during the COVID pandemic, the remaining capacity at its storage facilities, and efforts over the past decade to expand alternative export storage options, Iran is not in imminent danger of a major crude oil shut-in. Moreover, some Iranian tankers have reportedly been able to navigate the U.S. blockade, and Iran continues to export oil overland, albeit in relatively small quantities. It has also been estimated that, if Iran were to use its 20 very large crude carriers as floating storage, it could continue producing oil for a further 2 months. This would be in addition to its remaining onshore storage, which provides an estimated 2 to 3 more weeks of capacity. Overall, it is unlikely that the U.S. blockade alone will be capable of compelling Iran to make immediate concessions. Furthermore, it is unlikely that Tehran can be compelled to make significant concessions that could be perceived as yielding to the United States, particularly given the widely reported consolidation of power by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps hardliners. According to briefings by U.S. officials to the media, some figures within the Trump administration believe that continuing the blockade for a further 2 months could compel compliance from Tehran. Others, however, assess this view as flawed, citing the continued hardening of Iran's position. The IRGC commander, Major General Ahmed Vahidi, is highly likely to be exercising significant control over Iran's negotiating position. He is reportedly the only senior official with direct access to the supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. The potential importance of this access was illustrated on April 27th, when Iranian officials told Pakistani mediators that they would need to consult the supreme leader before responding to the updated U.S. proposals. Under the likely direction of Major General Vahidi, Tehran's negotiating position now appears to center on ending the U.S. blockade in exchange for Iran ceasing attacks on vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, while still extracting tolls from shipping for revenue. It also appears to favor indefinitely delaying negotiations on the nuclear file. However, without the leverage provided by the blockade, the United States would have limited ability to compel a hardening Iranian regime to make concessions on its nuclear program. Beyond the current stalemate, which will almost certainly, in time, generate major economic pressures for Iran, Washington may calculate that a return to conflict is the only means of more rapidly compelling compliance from Tehran. The reported withdrawal of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which would reduce the number of deployed groups in the CENTCOM area of responsibility from 3 to 2, the highest level since 2003, may reflect preparations for a relief in place with another carrier strike group. The Ford's 300-day deployment has been the longest U.S. carrier deployment in the past 50 years, and the vessel has recently experienced multiple issues. Meanwhile, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower completed sea trials at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard on April 24th and could be preparing for deployment to the Middle East. If the United States resumes strikes against Iran in an effort to break the current deadlock, this would highly likely trigger renewed Iranian attacks across the Middle East. Such attacks would likely involve a broader target set, including assets and infrastructure that enable Gulf states to export oil and gas while bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. This could include pipelines to Saudi Arabia's Red Sea port of Yanbu, as well as the Emirati port of Fujairah. Iran has repeatedly signaled that its forces are ready to resume attacks. Its military has highly likely used the ceasefire period to strengthen both offensive and defensive positions. Iranian units have likely regrouped, dispersed remaining assets, and repositioned forces to improve survivability against future strikes. These steps would also place Iran in a stronger position to conduct large-scale attacks against regional targets if fighting starts again. This has highly likely included the excavation of ballistic missiles and launchers that were buried following US-Israeli joint strikes, as well as efforts to restore damaged systems. Moreover, Iranian forces have reportedly moved transporter erector launchers out of range of some US long-range fires. Relocating these systems deeper into Iran likely means the United States would need to undertake higher-risk aerial operations to strike them after ballistic missile launches. It may also reduce the proportion of Iran's missile capabilities able to reach Israeli territory, which could, in turn, increase the likelihood of their use against Gulf states. Elsewhere in the region, a coordinated militant offensive in Mali has inflicted significant losses on government and allied forces. On April 25th, the al-Qaeda-affiliated Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin and the Tuareg separatist Azawad Liberation Front, the FLA, launched a joint offensive against Malian armed forces and Russian Africa Corps bases and units across the country. The operation involved coordinated attacks across three broad geographic areas: northern Mali, central Mali, and the Bamako-Kati area in the southwest. A series of ambushes, car bombs, drone strikes, and the use of conventional weapons reportedly inflicted significant casualties on both government forces and Russian mercenary personnel. In northern Mali, JNIM and FLA fighters seized Bourem, Kidal, Ber, and Gao, while isolating Malian and Russian Africa Corps forces at bases near Gao and Kidal. This forced a government and Russian withdrawal from the north. In central Mali, JNIM attacked Mopti and Sevare, briefly entering Mopti and overrunning positions near Sevare before withdrawing. In the southwest, JNIM launched attacks in the Bamako-Kati area, targeting the main airbase and residences linked to senior junta officials. Malian Russian forces reportedly repelled an assault on Modibo Keita International Airport using armored units and air support. JNIM operations in the south reportedly targeted junta leader Assimi Goïta, killed Defense Minister Sadio Kamara, and severely wounded, or potentially killed, junta intelligence chief Modibo Kone. On April 28th, the U.S. Embassy in Mali issued a security alert warning of possible terrorist movements within Bamako. It urged U.S. citizens to shelter in place and avoid any unnecessary travel. On the same day, JNIM spokesman Abu Hudhaifa al-Bambari announced the start of what he described as a total siege of Bamako. In the aftermath of the offensive, an independent Malian news outlet reported cases of mob violence in Bamako targeting Fulani and Tuareg individuals. Ethnic groups often portrayed as supporting, respectively, Islamist insurgents and the Azawad forces. Local authorities have imposed a curfew across the district of Bamako from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., starting on May 1st. They warned that movement would be restricted during these hours and urged civilians to adhere to the curfew, limit their movements, and follow official guidance. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The offensive has effectively resulted in the junta government ceding control of large parts of northern Mali to militant Azawad separatist and JNIM forces. It is almost certainly a major strategic and symbolic victory for the FLA and JNIM. With government and Russian forces withdrawing from military bases, and militants now controlling key urban centers and critical supply routes across the north, a government counteroffensive to retake lost territory is unlikely in the short term. Ground lines of communication between central and northern Mali are effectively severed. The loss of major bases that hosted junta and Russian drone capabilities will also significantly limit intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capacity. It will reduce the government's ability to conduct strikes against militant positions in the north. The coordinated attacks across Mali were likely intended to fix government forces in the south, shaping the conditions for operational success in the north. However, JNIM's targeting of junta officials in the south likely reflects a parallel effort to undermine the credibility and cohesion of the government. By degrading senior leadership and demonstrating the capability to operate in the most heavily securitized areas of southern Mali, the group reinforces that message. While militant forces likely lack the mass and capabilities required to effectively seize and hold Bamako, a city of almost 5 million people, without sustaining severe losses, the success of the offensive has almost certainly emboldened them. JNIM are highly likely to attempt to further undermine the junta by sustaining a blockade of the capital. JNIM has maintained a partial fuel blockade of Bamako since late 2025 and is almost certainly capable of disrupting key supply routes and conducting localized attacks on government forces near the capital or in rural areas across the south. Government and Russian forces, withdrawing from other parts of Mali, will likely redeploy to strengthen security in the south, particularly in central Bamako and Kati, and to secure critical infrastructure such as Modibo Keita International Airport. Sporadic attacks targeting these forces are highly likely. Given the dispersed and mobile nature of the militant threat, government and Russian forces are unlikely to fully secure all routes and areas within Bamako. The concentration of junta and Russian forces in the capital is also likely to create security gaps elsewhere in southern and central Mali. Militant forces are likely to exploit these gaps to conduct attacks and sustain increased pressure on the junta. Mali remains highly vulnerable to coups and has experienced multiple military takeovers since 2012, including in 2012, 2020, and 2021. Recent territorial losses, force withdrawals, and attacks targeting senior junta leadership have almost certainly undermined the current government and increased the risk of another coup. Several sources report that the attacks have triggered a political crisis in Bamako that could result in the ousting of Goïta. Elements within the Malian armed forces and government are reportedly backing General Malik Diaw, who leads the junta-controlled transitional parliament, to assume control of the transitional council. A coup, or preemptive efforts to suppress one, is likely to generate further instability. It could trigger fighting, extended curfews, arrests, and intensified security operations in central Bamako. Government setbacks have also increased the risk of civil unrest in Bamako. Previous territorial losses and militant attacks have triggered large-scale protest movements in the capital. Given the juntas and Russia's information operations, which typically attribute militant successes to hostile Western influence, particularly France, any protests are likely to feature anti-French and broader anti-Western sentiment. This increases the risk of demonstrations near Western diplomatic missions, foreign-linked businesses, and NGOs. There are already reports indicating an elevated risk of retaliatory violence against ethnic groups perceived to support militant forces. This could further inflame communal tensions and trigger unrest, particularly if militant groups target minority communities now under their control. In northern Mali, the collapse of government and Russian positions will likely increase the threat posed by the Islamic State Sahel province. The group is likely to exploit emerging security vacuums and the loss of key capabilities, including drones. Reports indicate that ISSP has already moved into previously contested areas. It will now likely reallocate resources to compete more directly with JNIM, particularly in the tri-border area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. In Central Africa, opposition calls for protests in Chad are unlikely to translate into large-scale demonstrations due to the threat of a forceful response. On April 25th, Chadian authorities arrested 9 members of the opposition Political Actors Consultation Group. Among those detained was the leader of the Democratic Party, Avok Souma Diona. The arrests followed an open letter from the GCAP calling for a march of protest and indignation on May 2nd. In a 4-page document, the GCAP criticized the political situation since the ruling regime assumed power in April 2021. It detailed more than 1,230 deaths over 5 years, 472 people forced into political exile, and numerous cases of extrajudicial arrests, enforced disappearances, acts of torture, and death threats against political opponents and members of civil society. Authorities have banned the demonstration, and Chad's Supreme Court has declared the GCAP and its activities illegal. Abdel Nasser Garboa, spokesman for the ruling Patriotic Salvation Movement, has justified the arrests on the grounds of maintaining public order. The opposition party Les Transformateurs responded to the arrests by stating that they disturbingly recall the arbitrary arrest of party president Suksay Masra since May 16, 2015. Masra was sentenced to 20 years in prison for incitement to hatred and violence in a trial widely condemned as politically motivated. Opposition leader and former Prime Minister Pahimi Padake Albert also criticized the arrests and called on the government to engage in dialogue with the opposition. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The protests are intended to denounce what organizers describe as a climate of political terror and to serve as a call for international bodies, including the UN and the African Union, to assume their responsibilities. Although Chad has ratified several international treaties guaranteeing the right to demonstrate, including Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Article 11 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights Authorities, have repeatedly cracked down on protests. The last major demonstrations in Chad took place on October 20, 2022, and are often referred to as Black Thursday. Protests erupted in the capital, N'Djamena, and in several other cities. Demonstrators opposed the President Mahamat Deby-led transitional government's 2-year extension and the delay in transferring power to civilian rule. The unrest was among the most violent in Chad's history. Dozens of protesters were killed and thousands were detained, injured, or arrested after security forces responded with lethal force, including live ammunition. The protests subsided only after the government imposed a curfew across major cities and deployed the military to the streets. Since Black Thursday, demonstrations have failed to gain traction in Chad. During the December 2024 elections, the country's first legislative vote in more than a decade, major opposition actors, including Les Transformateurs, boycotted the process. They denounced it as a sham and argued that the outcome had been predetermined. Despite widespread perceptions that the vote was fraudulent, protests did not materialize. Many highly likely feared further government repression. Despite opposition calls to demonstrate on May 2nd, protests are unlikely to gain significant traction. The planned GCAP-led march has been banned, and the reported April 25th arrest of 9 GCAP leaders will likely deter participation. Chad's recent record of violently suppressing anti-government mobilization will almost certainly reinforce that deterrent effect. As a result, any protest activity is likely to be limited, localized, and swiftly suppressed by security forces. However, the risk of arrests, confrontations, and isolated violence will remain elevated if opposition supporters attempt to defy the ban. In West Africa, further attacks on villages in northeastern Nigeria are likely as jihadist groups attempt to stretch security forces. Overnight, between April 26th and 27th, militants attacked the village of Guyaku in the Gombe local government area of Adamawa State, killing at least 29 people. According to witness accounts, the attackers raided a football pitch and opened fire at random before burning houses, places of worship, and motorcycles. The assault reportedly lasted several hours. Many residents of Guyacu have since abandoned their homes amid fears of further violence. The state governor initially blamed Boko Haram for the attack. However, Islamic State claimed responsibility in a Telegram post on April 28. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. While it remains unconfirmed which Islamic State branch carried out the attack, it is highly likely to have been Islamic State West Africa Province. Adamawa State is a key operating theatre for ISWAP. The group has designated the northern areas of the state as part of its Farouk Wilaya, or province, and has expanded its operations there in recent years. Adamawa State remains highly vulnerable to violence by jihadist groups and criminal gangs. ISWAP's core theatre in neighbouring Borno State typically prioritizes military bases, convoys, infrastructure, and other state security targets. By contrast, raids on villages are more commonly associated with the more poorly equipped Boko Haram, which operates as a regional competitor to ISWAP. The apparent effort to maximize civilian casualties, combined with ISWAP's rapid claim of responsibility, highly likely indicates that the attack was intended to be highly visible. Amid deepening U.S. involvement in Nigerian counterterrorism operations, the attack was likely intended to undermine current strategies and portray them as ineffective. By carrying out a high-casualty assault in Adamawa State, following increased international attention on Islamic State-linked activity in Nigeria, the perpetrators likely sought to demonstrate that neither Nigerian security forces nor external partners can prevent attacks beyond the most heavily monitored theaters. This, in turn, would allow Islamic State-linked media to frame the incident as evidence of continued operational resilience, despite expanded intelligence sharing and external support. Furthermore, there is a realistic possibility that the attack was intended to shift U.S. targeting away from Islamic State Sahel province in Sokoto State, where previous U.S. airstrikes have occurred, and towards ISWAP in eastern Nigeria. Such a shift would likely stretch counterterrorism resources, forcing Nigerian units to divide their focus between deeper operations in Borno State and ISWAP's peripheral areas of influence, including Adamawa. Further attacks are highly likely as part of a broader effort to overstretch Nigerian security forces and undermine state governance. And off the Horn of Africa, a spike in piracy incidents reflects favorable conditions and reduced naval coverage. At approximately 8 p.m. on April 26, suspected Somali pirates boarded a St. Kitts and Nevis-flagged general cargo vessel around 6 nautical miles off Garakad, Somalia. The vessel Sword was transporting cement from Egypt to Mombasa, Kenya, and had 15 Indian and Syrian crew members on board. The ship last signaled its position near the Somali coast at Durdura, while en route to Mogadishu. Following the boarding, at around 9 p.m., the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre raised the threat level in the area to substantial. The agency also noted that weather conditions were favourable for small boat operations. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. At least 4 other vessels, including a fishing vessel and an oil tanker, have been targeted off the Somali coast over the past week, marking a significant spike in incidents. The hijacking of the Sword is the second such attack on a merchant vessel in less than a week. The first occurred on April 21st, when 6 gunmen boarded the oil tanker Honor 25. These incidents form part of a broader resurgence in piracy off Somalia in 2026, following an 18-month period of reduced activity. That lull ended in November 2025, when pirates boarded the Malta-flagged tanker Hellas Aphrodite. The European Union Naval Force Somalia stated that it was monitoring a pirate action group that hijacked the Iranian-flagged Dhow al-Wasemi 786 approximately 400 nautical miles east of Somalia in late March 2026. By March 30th, the force had moved to isolate the vessel. The use of hijacked dhows and fishing vessels as motherships remains a key enabler of offshore piracy. It allows pirate action groups to extend their operating range well beyond the limits of small skiffs. Overstretched naval deployments and the reallocation of resources towards the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz have highly likely created exploitable gaps in regional anti-piracy coverage. These gaps have almost certainly been compounded by merchant vessels' increased willingness to transit the Horn of Africa high-risk area amid the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a development that has also driven up fuel costs. The Sword was operating just 6 nautical miles off the Somali coast. This may have reflected an effort to shorten transit times and reduce fuel consumption. The timing is also consistent with Somalia's seasonal piracy window before the southwest monsoon, which runs from June to September, begins to restrict small boat operations. This likely provides a narrow opportunity for opportunistic attacks, while sea conditions remain favorable, particularly if vessels are transiting closer to the Somali coast. Continued illegal fishing by foreign vessels off Puntland, combined with Somalia's internal instability and weak law enforcement, has also likely encouraged some fishermen to turn to piracy. Given these factors, further incidents of Somali piracy are highly likely through May, before sea and atmospheric conditions begin to limit small boat activity. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, renewed clashes along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border highlight the fragility of current peace efforts and the risk of further escalation. On April 26th, 6 Pakistani soldiers were killed and 1 captured during clashes with Afghan forces along the Durand Line. Afghan media reported that the fighting took place in Spin Boldak district in Kandahar province, approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Quetta. According to those reports, Pakistani forces initiated the exchange by opening fire across the international border, killing a child. On April 27th, Pakistan reportedly fired mortars and rockets into Kunar province in eastern Afghanistan. The indirect fire is reported to have killed 4 people and injured 70, with multiple casualties recorded at Kunar University in Asadabad, around 12 kilometers from the border. On April 29th, the Taliban government stated that its foreign ministry had summoned Pakistan's chargé d'affaires in Kabul to deliver a formal protest note in response to the attacks. The Taliban also denounced the strikes on civilians and academic institutions as unforgivable war crimes. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Afghanistan and Pakistan held week-long talks in China in early April, aimed at finding a comprehensive solution to their long-standing conflict. While the discussions did not produce a ceasefire or any formal agreement, Beijing stated that both sides had committed to avoiding actions that would worsen the situation. However, neither party has materially shifted its position. Pakistani allegations that the Taliban are sheltering and facilitating Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan militants and Baloch separatists remain the primary source of tension. In the days preceding the border clashes, Pakistan carried out counter-terrorism operations in the Khyber district of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, near the Afghan border. These operations reportedly resulted in the deaths of at least 22 TTP militants. The Inter-Services Public Relations, the Pakistani military's media wing, stated that weapons and ammunition were recovered. It also said that counter-terrorism operations would continue at full pace against what it described as foreign-sponsored militancy, a term Islamabad has repeatedly used to refer to militant activity it alleges is backed by the Afghan Taliban. The timing and location of Pakistan's counter-terrorism operations suggest a likely link to the subsequent border clashes. Despite sustained diplomatic engagement, the Afghanistan-Pakistan ceasefire remains highly vulnerable to localized incidents, which can quickly escalate into cross-border fire, retaliatory strikes, and border closures. Until a rigid and enforceable peace framework is in place, further cycles of escalation are highly likely. even if a substantive agreement is reached, it will likely remain highly vulnerable to the actions of militant groups that operate with a high degree of autonomy in the border regions. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.